Hello and welcome to the Parenting Through the Pandemic webinar. Today we're focusing on schooling. I'll probably revisit that. I don't want to put all the most important stuff in the first 15 seconds when a lot of people might not have joined yet. I am Brandon Tessers. Susan Tessers will be joining me in just a moment. I'm laughing because as we mentioned when we, kind of announced this and put this out there, and I'm going to say it now in case anybody didn't see it, but also as a refresher, Susan and I are married and we have 3 kids, a 5-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 4-month-old. And we have them all with us today. We're in a pandemic. We don't have childcare. So we'll be taking care of them while we do this. And that might mean that we're taking turns back and forth, stepping away, and Susan was getting a couple last things set up. So if you heard the cry, that's why. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. So spit up immediately from the 4-month-old. So just a bit of an overview of we'll introduce ourselves and talk about what we're doing here as I fiddle with the camera to make it. So Susan and I are both professionally trained and experienced in working with kids, young people. I am a licensed therapist, Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor in the state of Illinois. I run a practice called Effective Artistry, which is the channels that we're using to put this all out right now. We do therapy and executive functioning coaching. I specialize in neurodiversity and executive functioning. I have a background in working in education and with gifted people, doing professional training for teachers and presentations and yada yada.
And you work mostly with what age group?
It's spread out from teens to 50s, 60s, but I'd say probably 50% of my clients are between 16 and 30. So more in the high school age, college age, young adult. You want to introduce yourself?
I'm Susan Tessers. I did my undergrad at Boston College, where I majored in early childhood ed and human development, and then went on to teach and did a master's in reading at Northwestern, and then another master's in reading specialist at University of Illinois in Chicago. I taught kindergarten for 7 years, first grade for 3, second grade 1 year, and then I was a reading specialist for a couple of years, working with students from kindergarten through 6th grade. And now raising a family and working a little bit with effective artistry, but mostly just parenting in the pandemic.
Yeah. Which I think is kind of the most important part. Like we said, he's very distracting when he's awake. Usually he's asleep around now, which is why we thought this would be a good time. Like we said in the announcement, we both have professional background and experience working with kids. We also are parents, and we still are just having to figure it all out, right? We don't know how to navigate this any better than anybody else because nobody has anticipated or prepared for this or experienced this before. So we're all just kind of figuring it out. And that's the intention of what we're doing here together, is to just have a conversation with parents, and we can bring what we have, both our personal experience in doing this for a couple of years, Susan especially, who is home full time. It's all right. I can be distracted by him. You can time.
Okay.
But a conversation with parents, with all of you here. So just a quick technical note on how that works. For those of you who are watching, you can participate by putting anything that you'd like in the chat box there. If you are on Twitch, if you're watching through Twitch, it'll go under your Twitch user account name. If you're watching through Facebook, it'll go through your Facebook account. And if you're watching on YouTube, it'll go through your Google account, your Gmail account. So just be aware of that if you're posting anything, that this is publicly viewable, and that's the name that will be associated with your comment. We're going to kind of do a bit of a mix here today, where we might respond to questions as they're coming up, if people are putting them in the chat.
They're quick little answer questions, yeah.
Yeah. But generally, we're trying to fit a lot into this hour. So mostly when questions come into the chat, if they're not quick little ones, we'll probably collect and save those. And then tomorrow, Wednesday at 1 p.m., I do a weekly stream for an hour, 1 to 2 p.m. Central Time on Wednesdays. So during that, Susan will join me again and we'll answer all the questions, the bigger questions that we get today, we'll answer tomorrow during that time. Same place that you're watching this now. A little sip. So feel free to please participate in chat. It's nice to know that people are here and have some correspondence and some back and forth and dialogue. Yeah, did I cover all the
I think so.
basics?
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea is that this will be a series of webinars, and this is the first one. But of course, we'll see how it goes, and we'll figure it out as we go along, like we're doing everything.
For example, we thought that if we woke him up so I could feed him real quick, that he would go right back to sleep and hopefully last the hour, and we were wrong.
We were absolutely wrong, and you are adorable. So the focus of today's webinar is on schooling. Hello, thank you for the comments. Nice to know people are here. The focus of today's webinar is on schooling, talking about how to support our kids through pandemic schooling, whatever that means. For some people, that's remote, either voluntarily or not. For some people, that's in person. For some, it's one but might soon be the other, or the other but might soon be the original, or just uncertain. But no matter what, it is different. And we're all struggling with it, and our kids are all struggling with it. So we thought we'd contribute what we can. Anything to add to that? Why we chose schooling?
No.
Okay.
I mean, just because also we're struggling with it, right?
Yeah.
We, so our son is in kindergarten, and he was in person so far all this year. And then once winter break happened and the numbers started getting kind of crazy with Omicron, we decided not to send him back. The school is still in person, and they're just being, kind of flexible with us. Sent home his iPad. His teacher's been amazing, and sharing stuff on an app for us to do here at home, as well as sends out, weekly updates to all the families of like what they're learning in each of the content areas. So given my background and, we were just able to kind of supplement and have him learn from home for a few weeks until hopefully the numbers go down and then can go back in.
Yeah, and a general caveat here at the beginning as we talk about things. Some of the things we'll suggest are more general and some are more specific, but obviously different people have different options, different resources. We are very fortunate to enjoy a lot of privileges that allow us the option of keeping our kids home from school voluntarily. Not everyone has that option. So we're going to try and cover as much of things as possible, but just know that if we're suggesting something that doesn't work for you, we're aware that it doesn't work for everybody, and we're trying to cover as much as we can. Questions and feedback will help us target in more specifically. If you have younger kids, older kids, whatever, put things into the chat, and then that'll help us adjust and speak specifically to what's going on with the people who are here. We thought we'd start off with a little story.
Oh, no.
You did such a good segue earlier when you said we're struggling too, and then I didn't pick up on it because I was distracted.
I was not intending on going that direction.
Naturally do it. It's just your natural ability. So yesterday we were working on preparing for this webinar, again with all the boys, all three boys, because we don't have childcare. And we were stressing. And we had come up with probably about 20, 25 different frameworks and strategies and things we wanted to share. And we were thinking of it as like, okay, that's section one. Now we need 3 more sections. Totally by coincidence, we both just happened to have crying, emotional meltdowns yesterday. Oh, just like what a demonstration. Yeah, unrelated to the webinar for different reasons, but we'll talk today a little bit about energy management and resource management and how all of this stuff relates to everything else. Yeah, it was a rough day yesterday. Both of us were crying at one point or another. And of course, when I'm crying, Susan's crying, so she got to cry during my meltdown too. And finally, after the kids were in bed and we are exhausted and it's 8 p.m. and we've been waking up at 5 in the morning with the 2-year-old. So we don't have a lot. And we sat down and looked at the webinar, the outline that we had planned, and decided that we should scale back because we just didn't have it in us to to select from among all the other things that we could talk about which ones are most important. And of course, as soon as we did that, we realized how ridiculous it was to be trying to get through, I don't even know how many we were going to aim for, ending up with 50 or more different frameworks and things in a 60-minute webinar. And when that happened, we realized right then in that moment, this is a good story to tell, because it's a metaphor for a lot of what we're doing. Because when we looked at that and stepped back, we did it because we had to, right? Like, we didn't have the capacity to do more, so we had to look at it and step back. And when we did, it's not only that it's easier for us, it's better. It's better for us, and it's better for you guys, rather than us trying to drop 800 different ideas on you, like one per minute, that we can focus in on what's most important and take our time. And I think that is a really great metaphor for parenting, especially right now, where we add one thing and then another thing and another thing, and everything we add, there's good reason to add it. And when we add something else on top of it, we don't often go back and say, okay, what are the old things that we've been doing for good reasons do we drop to make room for this new thing? And we just get overloaded and overwhelmed, oftentimes until we have to take a break, one of two things: either you realize it's too much and you scale back, or you don't realize it's too much and you collapse and can't go forward anymore anyway, right? You either control when you take your breaks or you don't, but you're going to take them. And that when we do take a step back and reevaluate whether it's important to do all of these things that we've been doing, that oftentimes it's better for the kids, for us, for the kids, for everybody, that we realize, hey, let's scale back a little bit. We don't need to be doing everything that we've been doing. So that's like my way of telling everybody to lay off us, because we had breakdowns yesterday, but also making it normal, making it useful. No, really, a lot of what's been a struggle about this pandemic, especially with schooling, especially with parenting and schooling, is that humans, our brains generally, we're very good at solving problems. Yeah, bud. You take over for a second. What's that?
And the other piece is that, while especially raising young kids, but also older children too, that you want to be cognizant of how much you're sharing with them of what's going on in the world, and trying to keep things, positive when, it's tricky to navigate this time and make people feel safe and happy.
Yeah, I don't think that anybody could reasonably disagree with the statement that it is harder generally right now, that this context, this version of life that we're all dealing with, is more difficult than it was before this happened. And a lot of us didn't really take time when the context shifted to evaluate what things we were doing that made sense but don't make sense anymore, or what things that we were doing that were necessary or worth doing before but aren't anymore. So what I was saying when our 5-year-old came over is that our brains, the way they work, were really great at solving problems and really terrible at revisiting old solutions and determining whether they're still useful or necessary anymore. So part of what this is intended to be is just space for us all to kind of take a step back and evaluate what we're doing and what we want to continue and what we want to drop and what we want to change and what we want to add or whatever.
So in particular, when we were looking at, schooling through this pandemic, a lot of the concerns, especially at the end of last school year, was learning loss. What have our students accomplished or been able to accomplish with good job, with, the different school settings and challenges that the pandemic presented. So we thought we would take a little look at what is it's just a symphony of noise.
I don't know if you guys can hear the noises that he's making, but they're coming from all over the place.
Each end. When we looked at learning loss, it was like that summer slide that people always refer to. It's like, an example would be like reading level. What reading level did your student or your child end at the end of the year, and where are they starting at the beginning of the next school year? And it was typical that they might lose a level or two just based on not being in school during the summer. Mm-hmm. But now when we're looking at learning loss in current times,
how people are
how
talking
people
about it.
talk about it. It's more in terms of like a loss of potential. What could they have learned in a given year if things hadn't been interrupted, or they hadn't been at home, or their teachers weren't and students weren't wearing masks? And
Yeah. Which, I mean, the original concept wasn't flawless either. The idea that, oh, you've learned a thing and now you've lost it. But this new version of it that people are talking about is pretty nefarious, because it literally more or less just means suboptimal learning, right? Like anything other than the ideal. If what we're talking about is, oh, they could be learning more, or they could be learning better in some other circumstance, well, that's always true in any context but one, that there's one optimal thing. So why are we caring so much about it now? And a lot of it is really just, so I'm going to talk more about like the cognitive side of things, the psychological side of things, and Susan will be talking more about like the strategy and the practical side of things. And there's a cognitive bias we call availability bias, which just means that we tend to correlate how important information is with how easy it is for us to access that information, how available it is. So one way of talking about that is to say everything that we've done before, everything we've experienced before feels important to us to continue to do. Whereas things that are new and that we haven't experienced and we don't know about, we just don't deem it that important getting that information. And learning loss is one of those things where effectively what we're saying is we wish that we didn't have to deal with this context, which of course, yeah, man. If this was something that we could all just collectively decide was over, that'd be wonderful, but we can't. So we wanted to start there, partly because everybody needs to cut themselves a little bit of slack, and we'll get into some details on that, not just for yourselves, even not primarily for yourselves, but for your kids, partly because of what we're modeling, but mostly because of what we're asking them to do. I totally lost my train of thought. I woke up at 4:30 this morning with the because here's the thing is we're always learning constantly. Like if you're awake, your brain is doing something with information, getting new information, rearranging information you already have. Is he falling asleep? I was going to say, if he's falling asleep, let me take him and I can hold him while he sleeps. I can take him anyway. So a lot of what we're doing as adults, whether as parents or as educators, when your kid's at school, a lot of what we're doing is about selecting what things we think are important for kids to learn. They're going to learn one way or another. It's just we don't control what they learn if we don't select certain curriculum and certain lessons and put things in front of them, right? And that shift is important. If any of you in chat, by the way, it would be helpful to know how many of you are with younger kids or older kids, how many of you are remote versus in person, just so that we can kind of zero in on some more relevant and specific things for those of you who are here. But yeah, my specialty is executive functioning, and I talk a lot about this concept that's very important, is that first we have to know what we're trying to accomplish. Then we come up with a plan for how we're going to accomplish it. Then we execute the plan. And we teach those things to children backwards because, of course, we do. Okay. We might have to stand up and rock and take turns. Because when they're young, like when they're 4 months old, you just grab their hand and put it through the armhole. Like you can't instruct them how to do it. You just help them do what needs to be done. And then later we start to teach people how to make plans. And generally we don't do a lot of teaching people how to come up with what it is that they're supposed to be aiming at. But when there are problems, when something's not being executed well, it makes sense to start by looking at execution issues because that's the easiest place to intervene. But if that's not working, then we got to move upstream to looking at the plans. And if that's not working, we got to move upstream to the aims. What are we aiming at? So that's where we're starting here, is talking about aims, and then we'll talk a little bit about planning and then the execution. So we've got a good range of ages, and
Brandon did this last week too, where he said we had a 3 almost 4-year-old, and it's actually a 2 almost 3-year-old.
Did I just say that he was 3 almost 4 again?
No, I said last week he did that. But
yeah. Yeah. So we thought it would be helpful to start by talking about what happens at school during the day in more depth, because parents don't have as much information about that. So whether you're trying to do in-person learning at home, in which you're trying to replicate some of that, or whether your kids are going off to school and then coming home at the end of the day, it's still useful to know what it is that they're experiencing, so you have a better sense of where they're at when they get home and what they're doing at night.
So I can speak to, the primary grades and sort of middle school a little bit, but like my sister and like other people that have had to do remote learning at one point or another, we're stressing about filling the day. My kid is at school from 8:30 until 3:30. Is that 7 or 8 hours? I can't remember. 7 hours. And thinking that, that 7 hours is like a solid block of learning time. If they're not in school at time, I better make sure that they're doing something that, is academically rigorous. But really, if you're thinking about the number of transitions, no, he's good, he's comfy. The number of transitions that the kids go through and switching subjects, or going to specials, lunch, recess, brain breaks, all those things. I was thinking about this when I was planning out our son's at-home learning, is like, if you have like 2 to 2.5 hours of solid like learning time in a day, you are good. And obviously there's probably more learning happening in terms of like conversations you're having with your child, if they're doing some independent reading time, if they're on their tablets doing something, you find ways to make it more, but also it's not something you really need to stress about, of like book them 7 hours straight.
Not only not stress about, but if you try to do it, it won't go well, because the brain just isn't capable of doing that much intense intellectual labor over the course of the day. One of the things that I think is really interesting, is we were kind of comparing notes and preparing for this, is that 2.5-ish hour window, where we have good studies that show that in office settings, adults, in office settings, in an 8-hour day, spend about 2.5 hours of that time actually engaged in work tasks, because that's about what we're capable of doing when we're talking about cognitive work, right? Physical is a different thing, also exhausting and has its own limits. But these are two different. Some things make sense to say, let's do it 8 hours a day. Some things don't. And learning is not one of them. Not structured and guided learning, at least. There's a term, by the way, I'll just throw out there, latent learning, which means the learning that you do without consciously or intentionally doing anything. If you think about, probably all of you here haven't studied a map of your neighborhood, but could still navigate your neighborhood pretty well, because just by walking around, you pick up data, you pick up information and store it and start to construct a map in your head. So aiming for the right amount of stuff, and obviously we're talking there about young kids, and if you're doing remote learning, but the older the kids get, and if you're doing in-person, if your kids are doing in-person learning, it is incredibly important to understand when they get home where they're at. Because when we were talking about this, I mentioned to Susan, she's just rocking the boy right there. When Susan brought that up, I mentioned that, same for high school. And she said, wait, isn't high school, like back-to-back periods with small passing periods? And it is, but that doesn't mean that it works well. Those of you who have older kids, you'll probably notice that when they get home, they're just absolutely trashed. They've got nothing. And then having to do another hour or more of homework at night, which is this whole own terrible thing that maybe we'll talk about some other time.
An hour would be a good night, right? I can remember coming home with 3+ hours of homework in high school.
Yeah, and homework is not helpful in the learning process. We have good research on that as well. But what we want to know is where people are at, right? That what is it that they're being asked to do? And like we mentioned before, if a school or your workplace, we have a comment there about work hasn't been as flexible as schools and daycares have in terms of pivoting to virtual, closing altogether, that any institution, any organization that is not, if we haven't scaled back, if they haven't scaled back what they're asking of you, in a context which everybody recognizes and agrees is more difficult, then what does that mean? Either it means that they believe that they weren't asking you to do an appropriate amount of stuff before, but now it's appropriate because it's more difficult and now it takes up the challenge. Or they were asking for the appropriate amount of stuff before, and now by continuing to ask for more or less the same, and not everybody is, people are changing things and cutting things. But if that's the case, then we're just not recognizing the change, right? So keying into the context, I was going to pass it back to Susan, but she's having to step away for a minute, so I'll keep going. Keying into the context is important, and being clear on what it is that you're trying to do. So combining kind of those two things, one concept that's really important to understand is that optimal learning, the best learning in terms of efficiency and in terms of depth and retention, is interest driven. That effectively what we're saying is when people get to do what they want is when their brain does the best in acquiring and consolidating and retaining knowledge. So one useful framework, I think, is this metaphor that I use a lot, this visual little metaphor of imagine that you're planning a trip, and you can do it one of two ways. And of course, in reality, it's much more nuanced than this, and there's a lot of back and forth, but we're simplifying. That you can plan your trip one of two ways. Either you can look at all the destinations that are out there that are possible for you to visit. You can select which one seems the most interesting to you, where you want to go, and then you can work backwards from there to make a plan that ends up getting you there. Maybe I should just turn it over there. We can both stand up so that you're on camera too.
Oh, no,
No, I'm not. You don't need to sit down. And the advantage of that.
Sorry.
No, I won't bother you. Never mind. No. You don't need to be on camera. I just feel bad if you being over there. So you can look at all the destinations, select one, and make a plan by working backwards from there. The advantage of that is that you're in control of where you end up. You've chosen a destination and built the entire plan around it, so you'll get there most likely. The disadvantage, there's two of them. One, you can't go anywhere that anybody else hasn't told you about, because how would you select it as a destination? You'd have to know about it because someone else has been there and told you about it, whether that's in a book or in a conversation or whatever. And number two is that at many steps, at many points along that plan, along that trip, you're going to be doing things that you would not otherwise have done. So if we decide we want to go to Paris and we make a plan to go there, at some point we're going to be on a plane for, 8 hours, whatever it is, which is not an enjoyable experience in and of itself, but you do it because it's what you need to do to get to Paris, right? Now, the flip side is you can just look around wherever you are, take a look at everything you can see and decide in this moment, what can I see do I want to go do the most, right? And you start moving in that direction. And either when you get there, reassess and see where you want to go from there, or really every step along the way, new paths open up. You see new things, new angles on things, and you might switch at any point. And the advantage there is that at every step along the way, you're doing what you most want to do, and that you can develop and find things that work for you specifically that no one else has done before. The disadvantage, of course, being you don't control where you end up. You might end up in a place you don't like. You might end up in a place that you like, but then find out about a different place you could have ended up that you would have liked even more. And that gets really tricky. That's back to this learning loss thing. What are we comparing against, right? Because yes, this is I don't like to call it a disruption. People will call it a disruption because it's just life. It's the context of our lives right now, and it will continue to change, and hopefully in certain specific ways that we are looking forward to. We're caught in a loop now where I'm talking because you're called away, and then when you come back, I'm finishing up the point so you get called away again instead of us taking turns.
It's okay.
That nobody would choose this. This is not a good situation for us all to be in, and it is what our life is. So people will say things like, I don't pay attention to the news because it's depressing, which, makes sense. But then you're likely to make decisions that make sense in a scenario that isn't the scenario that we're actually in. So the more we try and pretend that reality is different than what it really is, the more we get in trouble. That was unrelated to the point I was making.
I was going to say, what happened?
Yeah. Which was that, yes, some things we determine are important enough to learn and be able to do that we make plans backwards from there to get our kids to those points. Even if that means that many steps along the way, won't be enjoyable or won't be as enjoyable. It won't learn as efficiently or as deeply. But that's kind of the balance to be aware of, is whenever you are asking yourself or your kids to do something, learn something, work on something other than whatever in the moment would be their first impulse to do, it's going to be more difficult, less efficient. You're going to get less return on whatever resources you invest into it.
I like that comment that says they really need transition decompression time at some point. We all do.
Yeah.
And so that's what I was talking about with Brandon when we were planning this out, is like when you're talking about like how to support your child's learning at home, whether your child, it's a difference between like if their child is remote, obviously you're going to include some like academic activities and do things like that. But when your child is in person, not only have they been in school for 7 hours, you know, having to like follow a given structure, interact with people, and do academic things on top of it all, which is exhausting. Then they get home and, you know, parents rely on having homework and things like that as things for them to do once they get home. But really, you're absolutely right that they need that decompression time. So, you know, we're fortunate that our school is a block away, so we walk to and from school. And I use that walk time with our son to ask him about his day. And again, our teacher's amazing and sends out, you know, the weekly updates of what they're learning in each subject area, so that I can ask more specific questions of like, oh, I see that you're starting a nonfiction unit. What book did you read today? What did you learn? You know, and in that way, it's not just the standard, how was school? It was fine, or it was good.
Yeah.
You want to ask those specific questions, but in that way, you're using that transition time from school to home to, you know, trigger their learning, remind them what they did at school that day. And it's close enough that they haven't already forgotten what they've done. And then once they get home, yeah, our son might just lay on the couch and hold his stuffed animal, and he does still suck his thumb, so do that as well. Or he might just want to watch a video on the Google Hub, whatever he needs to do to kind of reset. And it's not, you know, that's not the rest of his day, but he does need that time, just kind of like de-stress and, you know, get himself calm. And, you know, it's a lot that we're asking them to do.
Yeah. And the thing is, we all have built-in systems, and different people's systems like function differently. Obviously, we're not always accurate and on top of things, but our brains and our bodies, we have built-in systems to monitor ourselves and know when we need something. When we're feeling tired and want to take a break, that's because we're monitoring ourselves. We have interoceptive processes. We're reading actual physical data through our senses internal to the body. And it, you know, it manifests, we observe it as, oh, I'm tired, but that's based on data. It's not willpower. It's not character. I got distracted by the question. You read it and I'll keep going. No, one way I think to kind of clarify this point for a lot of people is there's research out there that suggests, for example, that everybody should drink 8 glasses of water every day, right? I think a lot of people are generally familiar with that idea. But really? Every single person is supposed to drink the same amount of water every day? That's what's optimal? Me, that I'm 6'5" and 240 pounds, and somebody else who's the same age as me but 5'2" and barely 100 pounds, we need the same water, whether we're in an arid climate or a wet one or a cold one.
I thought you were going to go into the whole Adam ruins everything thing. And
I do love that show.
And talk about how the hydration studies were done by Gatorade. And
yeah, those studies were coming from that stuff. And without getting too much into it, it's an important point, because a lot of what we structure around, like I said before, we see a problem and we come up with a solution. Humans are good at that. We're really bad at then later on being like, is this solution that I've been given actually the solution?
Or now that this has changed, is it still relevant or the best way to do something?
Or particularly in terms of research and school education, because anything that's large scale has to be generalized. So how do I know how much water I need to drink during the day? I get thirsty. My body has built-in mechanisms. I don't need to learn didactically, academically, how much I'm supposed to drink, right? So we have these concepts that overlay onto our natural way of navigating things. Our impulses are what our body's best idea in the moment of what we need is. And we want to override that a lot because we think about the future and other people and other things that we're not physically observing in our environment. We want to be able to override what we want, what our impulses are in the moment. But sometimes we go too far. So the question, the framework that's useful here is do what you want unless you have a reason not to. And that's not a rare exception. And same in parenting, let them do what they want unless you have a reason that they can't.
That question. Okay.
Oh, okay. Montessori education goes a lot more into this kind of thing as well. So when I say it's not a rare exception, I mean, at any given moment, I might have dozens of things I want to do that I shouldn't do for one reason or another, right? Like this isn't an unusual thing. It's just shifting the burden of proof, as opposed to how most people go about doing things, which is I need to do what I'm supposed to do unless I can justify doing what I want to do. I want to shift the burden of proof the other direction, that I do what I want, I let them do what they want, unless I know why it's not a good reason. One specific strategy and rule that I have for that is ask once, then ask why. Meaning I can ask myself or anybody else, Susan, one of the boys, anybody. I can ask anybody anything without understanding why I'm asking for it once. And if they do it, if I do it or they do it, great. But if not, if there's any pushback, whether that's in saying why or I don't want to, or just trying to do it and struggling or forgetting or whatever, then the next step isn't to ask again harder. The next step is to step back and say, okay, what is it that I'm hoping to get out of this? Because it might be that I don't even know. So when they ask, why do I need to do that? I don't have an answer. It might be that it's a good aim, but maybe we can come up with a different way to get there that's more suited to the individual. But yeah, it's not a matter of being nice and support. We need transition decompression time. Like I said at the beginning, either you plan around your breaks, you plan around your rest, you are aware of it and you work it into what you're doing, or you don't, and your brain and your body will force you to take breaks. And that's usually not a pleasant experience. So we follow their lead in terms of energy. Again, a specific framework, a specific strategy for that is to start by observing. Take over for a minute. I'll go. Come here.
Well, you don't want to finish your thought. You just thought I would just jump right in and say,
No, I
start
thought
with
maybe you
observing.
would switch to something else. He
Well,
actually is
finish
asking
your
you a
sentence.
question.
Come here around and let me
Go.
see it.
Ask once, then ask why. What was I starting in that sentence?
Start with observing.
Oh, start with observing. Cecil, who works with us at Effective Artistry, came up with this metaphor a long time ago that think of the ocean. The ocean is incredibly powerful. What? Okay, I'll get you a chair. Oh, in here?
Yeah.
Okay, you can sit in the chair. Think of the ocean, which is an incredibly powerful resource. That much mass moving. Well, if you observe what it does first, if you look at its patterns at the tide, and then take those observations and build around it to make it do whatever it is you're wanting to do, you can tap into that power. You can accomplish quite a bit. Yes, hello.
To me.
Get you close.
Yeah.
Okay, you were right close. Like
So one of the
2-year-olds
things
running.
we talked about, can we move on to talking about
Well,
our,
just the real quick finish to that is if you try to force the ocean to do something without observing it first, then it might just so happen to work with what it was already doing, but you might end up fighting against it, which is going to be an incredibly difficult process. And our minds are like that, are like the ocean in that way, if we observe first. So watch and observe, make schedules, record things so that you know. I'm going to tilt it up just a little bit so that you're not in the webinar. I don't know why, but I've gotten
you just finished someone's sandwich.
what?
The comment right there.
We finish each other's sandwiches. That's what I was going to say. We could sing that duet. If
No.
Go ahead.
Where do you want to take this next? Do you want to talk a little bit about the physical environment?
Yeah. So if we do,
Because it's kind of
Energy
biting us in the butt
management.
right now.
yeah, energy management.
Yeah.
You want to sit on my chair without me? Now
Do-
you're distracted by my watch. So 2 quick, more like framework concepts, and then we'll get into like a bunch of specific strategies. The idea is we all have finite resources. Time is one of those, and we're all aware of that. Energy is one. Everything you do takes energy. It's a finite resource. You run out, you recover it. We'll talk about that. It's dead. It won't turn on. Augie's outing me that I'm wearing my smartwatch just for the aesthetic appeal. It's dead. It doesn't actually work right
Really?
now. Yeah. Makes me look more professional. So energy is one. Attention is one. You can't notice everything. This is a very important one, especially for parents and kids, to know that when Susan and I are looking at the exact same thing, she's noticing different things than I'm noticing, and I'm noticing different things than you're noticing. And people sometimes push back on that and say things like, well, it's right there in front of you. How could they not notice? So here's
Literally one day I was taking out the trash and I emptied the trash from Brandon's home office, which was full of pistachio shells. So
good snack.
I emptied it, and then his office is in the basement. I literally put the trash in the middle of the doorway leading down to the basement so that, because he was on his way back down, so that he would see it, pick it up, and take it down with him. And literally, he walked around it down to the basement without even noticing it. And it blew my mind, and I was a little bit annoyed. So later on, I brought it to his attention. He's like, it didn't even register that you put it there for me to take it down. And oftentimes we make a good team parenting wise, because there's, the logistical side of things where like my mind is set on scanning the room and noticing like what needs to get done in terms of like diaper change. He needs to use the bathroom, change their clothes, get breakfast going. This is out of place. And Brandon scans the room to check in more emotionally. It's like, he looks like he's a little bit upset, or he's tired, and things like that. Whereas,
that's how it's
complementing
supposed
each
to
other.
work. Family, community. Yeah, it lives there now, right? As soon as something falls, like that lives there now. The point of family and community is that we take care of each other, we help each other, and some of that means that we specialize. You handle some things and I don't pay attention to them, and I handle some things and you don't pay attention to them. And that's a good thing. Of course, that requires that we communicate a lot. But just real quick, very cool. You just drew a creeper. I'm gonna craft creeper. So one quick like demonstration of this, and some people who are here have seen me a lot and have known, but I just want to point out that it's not about how obvious something is, that your brain makes determinations about what things are worth noticing and what aren't, because it can't do it all. You can't be aware of everything all at once. So until I say what I'm about to say 5 seconds from now, you are not aware in this moment, conscious of the feeling of the chair or the bed or the floor or whatever underneath your body. And as soon as I said that, you became aware of that thing. That data was always there. The skin, the nerve endings, the sense, it was picking it up, but your brain just determined that it wasn't worth noticing. So if we start with that concept that we have finite resources, we're limited, and we notice different things, that can make things a lot easier, that instead of coming at it as obviously you need to do this, or obviously I want to do that, or whatever, nice creeper emojis. No, it's not obvious to everybody. And whatever it is that you're noticing that they're not, they're probably noticing something else that you're not. So let's share those resources with each other. But mostly I'm introducing this concept today because what's important to think about is that anything anybody ever does or could do has a value to that person, how much they care about it, what they think they'll get out of it, or how bad they think it'll be and what they want to avoid or whatever. It also has a cost. Of those finite resources, how much will I have to spend in order to do this thing? And we're pretty aware generally as a culture that value varies from person to person, that some people care more about a thing than other people do. And so we tend to focus there, especially as parents. We do a lot of operant conditioning, which is, the fancy scientific term for punishment and rewards, right? That we get people to do what we want by making it more valuable to do it, or more valuable to avoid failing to do it in case of punishment. But cost varies from person to person as well. That there are some tasks that I will be able to do in a couple minutes without much effort, that you or Susan or somebody else would take an hour and quite a bit of energy. Vice versa, there are some things that will take Susan a lot less and that will take me a lot more. So we want to be aware of that in terms of how we're dividing things up. Certainly one important concept for, I think, parents, co-parents, and I, of course, want to acknowledge too that not everybody has somebody else co-parenting with them, but we're drawing on our experience where we do. That we want things to be equal. That doesn't mean equal participation in each task, right? There are some things that are more enjoyable or easier for me. We don't need to split that 50-50 if it's miserable for you. And then you do this other thing. One of our weirder trades is I always fill up the cars with gas. She eats all the heels of all the bread, just silly little stuff like that. But I don't like the heels. She doesn't mind. She doesn't like filling the car with gas. I don't mind. But from parenting, not being co-parents with each other, but in interacting with our kids, we want to know that cost varies from person to person, how much it takes somebody to do something. So if someone is not doing something, there's a general thought that if anybody isn't doing something, it's because they don't want to, that we all do everything we want. And that's not true. We don't. It's a harmful idea. We all have way more things that we want to do than that we can afford to do. And especially right now, where we're still trying to do so much, like we were talking about at the beginning, we're trying to do everything we were doing before, plus new stuff in terms of masking and keeping people safe and whatever other things, in a context that's more draining and everything costs more. Making things more valuable doesn't always work. And in fact, sometimes it actually hurts. If I say, do you want $1 million? Do you want $1 million, Susan?
Yeah.
Great, just give me $2 million and you'll get $1 million out of it. Like, then all of a sudden, no, I don't want it. And flip. So a way of thinking it is, if somebody thinks that the value of a thing is less than the cost of a thing, accurately or not, they don't do the thing. If they think that the cost is equal to or less than the value of a thing, then they do it unless they can't afford to. And so in that same ridiculous metaphor, if I say, give me $1 million and I'll give you 2 million, well, great, that sounds like a good deal, but I don't have $1 million to give you. And then if I change it to say, well, fine, okay, I'll give you 5 million. I still don't have $1 million to give you, and now I just feel worse about it. So we'll switch into like some specific strategies and things, but a lot of this is going to be centered around that idea of what we want to do is try and manipulate the cost more than the value. Things that we want people to be able to do, our kids to do, let's try and make it easier for them to do those things. Things that we don't want them to do, and this goes for ourselves too, things we want ourselves to do or not do. Instead of just making it more important, make it cheaper to do what we want, make it harder, more expensive to do the things that we don't want. So let's talk a bit about physical organization.
So specifically, like today, getting ready for the webinar, we knew we had an hour where we were going to try not to be interrupted as much as possible, which, there's been a few distractions here and there, but overall they've done a really good job considering their ages. But so I set up the family room kitchen area kind of as like a center style, having the primary focus here. But, looking at what their interests are, like bringing up toys from the basement, like, oh, I'm going to make sure that I set up the track with some cars for the 2-year-old and a couple puzzles that he enjoys and crayons and a big coloring pad and his tablet, which just now he just started using it. He's been distracted by all the other toys. And for the 5-year-old, we have set up that he can check, football stats on the hub, which he is obsessed with doing right now, and fine. But then also like his drawing right now of the creeper, he likes to use the hub to look up pictures and then copy them onto the paper.
The hub is our smart home screen thing.
And then other things that I set up his school tablet so that he has to do an activity on that, and then setting up, different letter sound puzzles and things like that to work on some of the early literacy skills. Now, most of the school stuff I'll do with him later. I like to do like one-on-one with him. So I set up things that I know he'll have like a high success with.
There's a reason that classrooms have, like elementary classrooms have so much environmental print, for example, which is all the signs and things all over on the wall that have writing on it. That, like we talked about before, that availability bias thing. If we want someone to do something, one way to make it cheaper and easier to do that is to make it so that they don't have to remember, right? So that can come in the form of reminders, but it can also come in just making it visible. If we want the kids to use the tablet less than they do, we don't have to enforce something which is difficult and potentially combative, but requires us to be vigilant and whatever, right? We can just store it in a place where they don't see it and they have to think of it to ask first. That'll be less than if they see it out, they're going to ask for it more frequently. And vice versa, things that we want them to do, we want them to see more. Modeling is a very important part of this, that as parents, the best thing that you can do in terms of helping kids with their learning is model. What you do, again, this is how the brain is wired. We learn off of other people.
If you think about, we had this one friend who was a Montessori teacher for a while, and we went over there for a play date. This was a while ago, pre-pandemic, and she had 2 little kids, and her whole like great room, kind of like common area. It wasn't a big house, but she had the whole room set up with like these low bookshelves, toys that were easily accessible to the kids, and like nicely organized. So it was like appealing to the eye. And then just like in one area, there was this single couch, a TV. So like that was their like living room, family room kind of space. So literally like while we're sitting there chatting or whatever, the kids are just free to roam and, access anything they want. And they'd come in and check in, or we would comment on something they were doing. But one of the things that impressed us the most was she would talk about how like there were days, and not often, but some days where they would be totally independent doing that. And she would sit up on the couch reading a book. And we were like, not only is that like great for the adult to have some space where they can, step away and do something that they enjoy or just kind of recharge a little bit, but also that they're getting that model early on of like, hey, my mom enjoys reading, or my dad likes to pick up a book, and that might be something that I'm going to enjoy someday doing. And
yeah, you're
we're
modeling
doing right now
the activity, but it's also important for parents to think about what we're modeling in terms of our own awareness of our energy and how we're managing it, right? That there's a lot of guilt thrown at parents from all directions, that we need to be constantly involved with our kids, that if they're awake, we must be interacting with them, we must be pushing them, growing them, in some particular way.
And we did have like a very honest conversation with the kids last night at dinner, just being like, today was a rough day. Because they pick up on it. Like our 2-year-old is clinging to our leg, giving us a kiss, and be like, you okay? Like, the 5-year-old.
Yeah. What are you modeling?
Senses it. So
if you're pushing yourself to that extent, if you feel as though you need a break, but you push through it, what are you teaching them about what you think they should do? Even if that's not your intention, that's what they see. If they see people who are aware and talking about their own limits and their own experiences and adapting based on that, trying to keep the original intentions in mind and adjust as much as necessary and blah, 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 then that's what they learn how to do.
And once you start ignoring it, that's when you start getting short with them and, tense between each other, and they pick up on it. So.
If you walk into the other room to cry and they never see you cry, how are they going to feel when they cry, right? So this self-awareness piece, this communication piece, doing things with each other, with the kids, in front of the kids. Even when we have disagreements, we don't step into the other room because that's a reality of things, right? We want kids to see how to navigate difficult conversations.
Yeah, and they need to see that a woman's going to win the argument every time, right?
Yeah, we got 3 boys, they got to learn. No, so a specific thing here, in addition to the like larger concept of modeling, is a concept we call body doubling, which is, again, we tend to prioritize social cues as humans, and different people do it to different extents. But we base what we do. If you're walking down the street and all of a sudden a bunch of people start running the other direction, you're probably going to start running with them. If not, you're still going to feel uncomfortable if you keep going in the direction you're going. You're like, what am I missing? We're wired that way. So if you are trying to support your kids, your older kids, for example, high schoolers or college age kids, they're struggling to do homework. Well, one of the easiest things you can do is just sit with them while you do your work, because we read those cues. If other people are engaged in some intellectual labor, well, then maybe I should do that as well, which brings the cost down. It makes it easier and more efficient.
Brandon is never happier than when he like comes into a room and like we're all like peacefully engaged doing something that we want to do. If I'm reading a baking book and he comes in the room, he's like, "Oh, great!" And like, he's like, "What do I most want to do right now?" Or like,
if we stress, they stress. If
Yeah.
I stress, you stress. If you
Right.
stress, So that's our best avenue as parents. Of course, we want to know that didactic stuff, the academic stuff, and we can talk about some of that stuff, especially if we get questions. We can get into more depth tomorrow during the stream. But as opposed to trying to become an adjunctive faculty, basically, that's not what you are. You're their parent, and you got to be their parent, which means you got to interact with them as a human being, not as the person who determines what things they need to do or not do at all times, right?
yeah. And I know like last week when we did the stream, we got questions around like, students that aren't interested in reading or different areas in school, and how do you get them to be interested in it? And I mean, as always, it seems like such a simple answer and won't solve the problem, but it is like figuring out what are your child's interests. What's something that if you got a book on this topic that they're really interested in, what are the chances that maybe they'll sit a little bit longer and read a little bit longer, or turning it into a social thing of like, books were never more popular in the classroom than when you had a student that, you're friends with or that you admire recommend a book. All of a sudden it's flying off the shelves, right? So if you turn something that is a struggle into something that, not only engages the students' interest, but have the social component of, hey, let's have an online book club with your friends, or let's have a book club within our family, something that we're all reading together and talking about. Suddenly a painful task might seem a little less painful or a little bit more enjoyable.
Yeah. You don't have to enforce it if you just make it appealing, right? And of course, there are some times that we got to enforce things because that's what, we're parents. There are some times that you just don't let them run in the street, right? Because we know it's not safe, even if they don't. So it doesn't mean we step back and don't do anything. It just means that we've got to be clear on what we're trying to get them to do and why. And I think it's important, not just in terms of like, if we want them to read, how can we modify things so that they can read, but in the other direction too, where whatever it is that they are doing, are engaged in, we want to participate in that. If your kids play a video game, play the game with them. Let them teach you. If you don't enjoy it, well, think of all those times that you wanted to do something as a family that they didn't want to do, and you said, I get it, but we're doing it as a family. Like sometimes you do things just that way. Because in addition to having that quality time together, first of all, you might learn more about them and the thing that they're enjoying. You might even enjoy yourself. But if nothing else, you're just spending good time building that relationship with one another, and you're building language with each other. You can reference things that will carry concepts more quickly and easily and deeply if you share those experiences. Mm-hmm. We're just kind of all over the place in like the various different strategies that we're recommending here.
Yeah.
But really, one that sounds very silly but is very like, webinar recommendation strategy is scale energy. We focus on time. We plan around time. This is going to be the time to do X, Y, and Z. And then the time arrives and we've kept it clear, but we don't do the thing. And when we don't always understand why. And we'll often talk about, that's awesome. Thank you. We're almost done. And then I'm going to come talk to you about this. Okay. Just a couple minutes.
Can I watch the video?
Yeah. That we focus on time because we have clocks. We have ways of observing and discussing those things. Well, as a family, we want to be able to talk about energy too. If the time arrives and I don't do it, it's likely that it's because I didn't have the energy at that time to do it. So I make a 1 to 100 scale of energy, and we'll check in with myself on where I'm at. I'll check in with myself about how much a thing just cost me. I was at 80 and now I'm at 60. And it's also useful to know that some things restore energy. Some of that is sleeping and eating and that kind of obvious stuff, but also doing the things that you enjoy doing is energizing. And completing tasks that you don't enjoy but that are important to you restores energy. What are you smirking about?
You telling me yesterday that
Yeah, this is a thing for, the brain, you get dopamine release and blah, blah, blah. It feels good to complete something that you think is meaningful, even if the thing itself isn't enjoyable. But you get the reward, the energy from it when you complete it. And what counts as completing it is dictated by you. If you say, I'm going to read a book, you get it when you finish the book. If you say, I'm going to read a chapter, you get it when you finish the chapter. And how much of a reward you get varies based on how difficult the thing is. But if you've got a lot of different things going and you're putting a lot into all these different things and it's not happening, Cecil's giving us the wrap-up sign, then often that's why you're putting energy into all these things and not getting the reward out from completing something. So start scaling that and talking with people. How many points of energy does it cost you to do this? What can we do that will regain you some energy? Where are you at right now? And of course, I want to fit in like more frameworks and strategies because that's what we do. But
We can talk tomorrow.
yeah, we're going to wrap up. So please, thank you for being here with us. I honestly don't know when we're going to do this again. It's fun. I want to do it again. I don't know when.
Fran just loves talking.
Well, yeah, especially with you.
Oh.
Which, by the way, quick little side note, some people get energized by talking. Some people get drained by talking. I know that's commonly known, but just know that even in a family that varies. And it's not just that. Anything that energizes you might drain me and vice versa. So we want to be aware of that. Yeah, we'll probably do this again. And I don't know, we'll announce it out in whatever various ways that we're able. But for now, we're going to wrap up because we said it would be an hour and it's an hour. And we don't want to take anyone's time. Please, so there are some bigger questions already in here that we didn't address, some even very from the beginning of like the logistics of how to navigate the fact that your work isn't being as flexible as your kids, daycare or school is, what counts as learning and how much can you fit in, things like that. But if there are any other questions, please feel free to continue to add them even after we end the broadcast here, because that chat will still be able to access it. And then tomorrow we'll go through those questions at 1 to 2 p.m. Central Time.
Awesome. Thank you.
And thank you all for being here.